It often began around dusk. Just as the shadows grew long on the walls and the last bits of sunlight slipped behind the trees, the crying would start. Not the quiet whimper of a restless child. No, this was something deeper. A long, breathless wail. A cry so raw and tired that even the walls seemed to groan in sympathy. They called it the crying hour. In rural Ohio, in dusty corners of Arkansas, in the brick row kitchens of Philadelphia, mothers knew the sound too well. After a long day of chores, hauling water, boiling laundry, stitching buttons, scrubbing hands raw with lye, they would sit, bones aching, as the infant in their arms howled like a soul adrift. And there was little they could do. There were no pacifiers, no baby swings, no glowing lullaby mobiles. A child in 1870 was comforted the old way, by warmth, by rocking, by patience. But sometimes patience wore thin. Sometimes the baby wouldn't stop, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't be soothed. And in those moments, when exhaustion turned to despair, a solution emerged from the back of the pantry shelf. A glass bottle. Small, brown, with a cork stopper. Some called it Mother's Friend. Others called it Godfrey's Cordial, or Soothing Syrup, or Infant's Quietness. But most knew what it really was. A bottle of liquor, laced with laudanum, or morphine, or opium, sometimes all three. Not for the mother, but for the child. In 1870, it wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual. Pharmacies sold them. Newspapers advertised them. One ad promised. For teething, for colic, for sleeplessness. 1 teaspoon to ensure a quiet night. It was easy, even encouraged. Because in truth, the world was terrifying for babies, and just as terrifying for the women trying to raise them. Imagine the life of a young mother in that era. Married at 16. 4 children by 25. A husband who worked 14 hours in a mill or didn't work at all. A leaking roof. No heat. No savings. And a baby that screamed from dusk until dawn. What tools did she have? No pediatrician. No books. No understanding of food allergies or developmental disorders or overstimulation. Just the noise. And the pressure. And the fear. The first time a mother gave it, it felt like mercy. A few drops on the tongue. The baby blinked. Coughed. Then settled. The room quieted. The mother exhaled. She could cook dinner now. She could rest her arms. Maybe even close her eyes for a minute. She didn't feel like a bad person. She felt like a person trying not to break. And so, the bottle stayed on the shelf. The next time the baby cried, truly cried, to the point of gasping, she reached for it again. And again. And again. The crying stopped. But so did something else. Historians have pieced together bits of this forgotten ritual from old journals, doctors' ledgers, and city coroner reports. What they found was sobering. In working-class neighborhoods, infant mortality rates soared. Not from disease, but from failure to thrive. Babies who simply faded. Who slept too much. Who stopped feeding. Who never cried again. It wasn't always the mother's fault. It wasn't even always the liquor. But the pattern was unmistakable. In one Boston tenement in 1872, 12 infants under the age of 1 died in a single building within a month. The cause listed for each. Summer fever. A polite way of saying, we don't really know. But some doctors did know. They just didn't want to say. Because to say it would be to blame the mother. And who among them didn't know a mother who had done the same? There was a quiet complicity in it all. The pharmacists sold the bottles. The newspapers ran the ads. The doctors gave knowing nods. And the mothers, exhausted, isolated, aching, poured a few drops into a spoon, praying for just one peaceful night. And sometimes, they got it. The house would still. The fire would flicker softly. And in the bassinet, the baby would finally sleep, face serene, breath shallow, dreams unknown. But what price did that silence carry? Of course, not every mother reached for the bottle. Some wrapped the baby in tightly laid quilts and sang lullabies in broken voices. Others strapped the child to their chest and kept walking until their legs trembled. A few simply cried with them, rocking back and forth, hoping their own tears would lull the baby to sleep. But even those mothers knew about Mother's Friend. And many, eventually, would try it once. Just once. And that's how it always started. The story of why mothers gave their babies liquor in 1870 isn't just a strange historical footnote. It's a window into a time when women were left to navigate motherhood in silence, when medicine was unregulated, when pain was hidden behind lace curtains and herbal remedies. It's not a story of cruelty. It's a story of desperation, of loneliness, of a generation of mothers who did what they thought was best, even when the results were tragic. And that's only the beginning. Because as we'll see in the next chapter, the syrup industry didn't just survive. It flourished. And the people behind it, they made fortunes off sleeping babies. Behind every bottle of soothing syrup was a smiling businessman. Not a doctor, not a nurse, not even a parent, usually, but a man in a suit, often with a thick mustache and a gleaming pocket watch, who had discovered something quite lucrative. Silence sold well. Very well. Especially when it came in a bottle small enough to fit in a woman's apron and strong enough to knock a baby into next Tuesday. One of the most famous purveyors of this bottled quiet was a man named James Curtis Godfrey. Godfrey wasn't a chemist. He wasn't particularly interested in babies. But he was a man who understood opportunity. In the mid-1800s, he began bottling what he called Godfrey's cordial, a syrupy mix of alcohol, treacle, and powdered opium. It cost just a few pennies. It promised mothers peace. And it worked. Soon, Godfrey's cordial could be found in corner shops from Edinburgh to Ohio. A little brown bottle on the shelf, right between the molasses and the liniment. But Godfrey was just one of many. Across England and America, men with names like Winslow, Dolby, and Jane began launching their own concoctions. Each one claimed to be gentle, harmless, or recommended by mothers everywhere. But beneath the pretty labels and sweetened flavors lurked potent sedatives, and highly addictive ones at that. Consider Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Created in 1845 by Charlotte Enu Winslow and marketed by her son-in-law Jeremiah Curtis, it became one of the most successful patent medicines in American history. The formula? Approximately 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce. That's the same morphine still used today in hospitals, in extremely controlled doses, for severe pain. But in 1870, that morphine was being spooned into the mouths of newborns. Mrs. Winslow's ad copy called it the mother's blessing. The British Medical Journal, much later, called it what it really was, a child killer. By 1860, soothing syrups were a booming industry. Newspapers ran glowing testimonials. Posters depicted cherubic babies fast asleep in cradles surrounded by flowers. One ad even showed a young mother smiling peacefully, her eyes closed, as the baby slept beside her, the empty bottle just barely visible on the nightstand. The sales pitch was simple. You're not drugging your baby, you're caring for them. You're not doing harm, you're ensuring rest. You're not alone, thousands of other mothers are doing the same. And the truth? They were. Mothers from all walks of life, rich and poor, rural and urban, were buying the syrup. Not because they were reckless, but because they were desperate. Because it was there. And the men who sold it, they knew. They knew the babies would sleep. They knew the mothers would come back for more. And they knew, eventually, that some of those babies wouldn't wake up. But by the time that happened, the money had already been made. In 1871, a small group of reform-minded physicians tried to sound the alarm. They began publishing quiet articles in dusty medical journals, warning that morphine and laudanum in infant remedies were causing respiratory failure and death. They wrote of babies who stopped breathing after 1 teaspoon too many, of toddlers who could no longer speak, walk, or feed themselves, of symptoms that looked like sudden illness but were really overdoses in disguise. But those articles weren't widely read. And the syrup sellers weren't worried, because their biggest ally wasn't the pharmacy counter. It was advertising. In an era before the FDA, before medical regulation, and before consumer protections, the newspaper page was law. And ad men knew how to write scripture. One 1870s ad for Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup read, "It soothes the child, softens the gums, allays all pain, cures wind colic, and is the best remedy for diarrhea." Another promised, 20 million bottles sold, mothers cannot be wrong. And the mothers, they saw these ads between articles about weddings and farming tools. They clipped the coupons. They trusted the smiling illustrations. And when the baby cried, as all babies eventually do, they reached for the bottle with the label that promised quiet. Because quiet, in 1870, wasn't just a luxury. It was a survival mechanism. The most astonishing part, the U.S. government didn't step in. Not yet. The syrup sellers continued unchallenged. Their products lined store shelves. Their fortunes grew. They built houses with marble floors and carriages with gold trim. And all the while, babies across the country dozed, deeply, dangerously, in wood-framed cradles. And the mothers? They weren't reading the British Medical Journal. They weren't aware of the slow poisoning. They were told, over and over again, that they were doing the right thing. That's what made it so tragic. This wasn't a story of mothers making bad choices. It was a story of mothers being told lies. Lies backed by advertising, by profit, by silence. Let's walk into one of those syrup kitchens. Not the kind with checkered aprons and copper kettles, but the kind in a dim back room. Low ceiling, one flickering oil lamp, shelves lined with unlabeled bottles, a stack of crates leaking dark, sticky residue. In the center, a heavy wooden table where a man in shirt sleeves pours thick liquid from jug to jug, whistling quietly to himself. This was not medicine. This was marketing, brewed by candlelight. In 1870, there were no factory inspections for medicine, no standardized formulas, no laws requiring ingredients to be disclosed. The truth was hidden beneath cork and glass, and behind every bottle, there was a recipe, or several, scrawled in ink-stained ledgers. What went in these soothing syrups? You'll need a strong stomach. Here's a common 19th century formula for infant soothing syrup found in a surviving American apothecary book. 1 ounce laudanum, that's opium mixed with alcohol. 2 ounces spirits of camphor. 1/2 ounce tincture of rhubarb. 1/2 ounce bicarbonate of soda. 4 ounces peppermint water. 8 ounces simple syrup. The peppermint was for taste. The soda was for show. The rest? A narcotic cocktail. And not one word of it was required to appear on the label. Some syrups went even further. They added chloroform for extra drowsiness, or ether for immediate calm. Others mixed in alcohol by the ounce, brandy, gin, even whiskey, believing it would settle the bowels and encourage sleep. Some versions didn't even bother to filter their ingredients. Bits of unprocessed opium, gritty and dark, sometimes remained suspended in the syrup. In one reported case from 1873, a doctor opened a returned bottle and found sediment thick enough to smear like ink. Still, these bottles kept selling. Why? Because the label didn't say poison. It said soothing. And the baby went quiet. Here's where it gets darker. These syrups didn't just make babies sleep. They made them stop eating. Morphine suppresses appetite. It slows the digestion. It dulls hunger pangs and dries out the mouth. That meant nursing infants began refusing to feed. Toddlers went limp in their mother's arms. Their little bellies didn't bloat, they shrank. Some children became addicted after just a few days. Try to wean them off. They'd scream uncontrollably, shake, sweat, vomit. So mothers did what made sense. They gave them more. Not because they were careless, but because they were trapped. A heartbreaking letter from an 1872 New York newspaper paints the picture clearly. A mother wrote, "I gave the syrup because I was told it was kind. But my boy sleeps too long. His lips are dry and pale. He no longer smiles when I call his name. My husband says I've done something wrong, but I only followed what I was told. The other women do the same." That letter wasn't unusual. Doctors began noticing what they called quiet children, babies who made no sound, who barely moved, who failed to gain weight. They called it infantile wasting. They didn't always know it was the syrup. Sometimes they blamed weak constitutions, or bad milk, or teething. But sometimes, they knew. And those doctors began whispering to each other. The syrup is doing this. The syrup is killing them. The pharmaceutical companies had an answer for that too. They published pamphlets. They ran even more newspaper ads. They sent out spokesmen, always dressed like doctors, to appear at women's groups and town halls, praising the products. One even went so far as to say, "An active baby is an unhappy baby. Rest is health. The syrup provides rest." Another pamphlet assured women, "Our formula contains no dangerous narcotics, only the gentle extract of opium, nature's sleep bringer." Of course, there was no such thing as a gentle opiate. But in a world where science hadn't yet caught up, and where regulation hadn't even begun, the lie was easier to sell than the truth. Perhaps the worst irony? Many of the people profiting from these syrups were fathers. Men who worked in the advertising departments, the bottling plants, the distribution offices, who went home each night to homes with children of their own. And yet, they kept selling a product they wouldn't dare give their own baby. When asked why, one syrup distributor in Boston reportedly said, "It ain't my place to teach mothers what's best. My job is to sell the bottle. What she does with it, that's on her." The shrug of a man too far removed to care. So what was missing from the bottle? Everything that mattered. No ingredients. No warnings. No dosage instructions. No age limits. No expiration date. No conscience. It was a bottle of sleep. A bottle of silence. A bottle of slow, sweet poison. And no one, not the mothers, not the nurses, not even many doctors, knew just how deep the damage went. It started with quiet. A baby that once cooed at the ceiling beams now stared blankly through them. A toddler who used to laugh at shadows stopped reacting altogether. They didn't cry anymore. They didn't play. They didn't flinch when the cat knocked over a pot or when the floor creaked beneath heavy boots. To the outside world, these babies looked well behaved. Polite, even. Some mothers felt relieved. But then the doctor came, and he'd press a stethoscope to a tiny chest, or flick a reflex in a limp leg, or shine a candle in a dull, half-lidded eye, and he would frown. "Does she respond to your voice?" "No." "When did she last eat?" "Yesterday. Maybe the day before." "And how much of the syrup have you given her?" "Only as needed. Maybe 2 spoonfuls. Every few hours." But in 1870, no one had a standard spoon. Some spoons were enormous, for soup. Others were dainty silver heirlooms. A teaspoon could mean 5 milliliters or 50. And every mother had her own idea of a little. That's where tragedy slipped in. By the early 1870s, some city doctors began keeping quiet ledgers, lists of infants who passed away unexpectedly or under unusual fatigue. They called it failure to thrive, sudden infant death, crib fever. But among themselves, some whispered a darker phrase, forgotten to wake up. It was the only way they could describe it. These weren't fevers. These weren't infections. They were just gone. One New Jersey doctor wrote anonymously in a medical journal in 1874. The baby was in excellent health 2 days prior. Mother reports use of Mrs. Winslow's syrup to quiet teething distress. Found child asleep in crib. Rigor had set in by the time I arrived. No signs of struggle. No fever. No lesions. I suspect overdose, but have no legal grounds to declare it. That same year, another doctor in Baltimore kept a grim personal note. Of all the infants I've lost this spring, 5 had used the syrup. No one will speak of it. The mothers weep, but the bottles remain. Let's be clear, not every child died. Many survived. But survival came with a price. There were the babies who never quite developed normally, who walked months late, or didn't speak until age 4, or showed sudden rages and nervous tics. In poor neighborhoods, these symptoms were chalked up to bad nerves or poverty of the blood. But some mothers whispered among themselves, "I think it was the syrup." Because how do you ask if your child is strange? Because of something you gave them. That guilt lingered. And it wasn't just the children who suffered. Mothers began to carry secrets. Some buried the bottles in the garden. Others poured the remaining syrup down the privy in the middle of the night. One woman in Kansas reportedly wept so hard after her son's funeral that she confessed, mid-sob, to giving him just a bit too much of the soothing drops. But of course, she hadn't known. None of them had. There were no dosages, no warnings, no truth. The only thing printed clearly on those labels was hope. And so the cycle continued. Pharmacies kept selling. Mothers kept buying. The babies kept quiet. And the country, as a whole, kept looking the other way. Until one day, slowly, and too late, a few brave doctors and journalists began to ask, what are we putting in our children's mouths? That question would spark a revolution in medicine. But in 1870, the answer was still unclear. Too many families had lost too much. And no one was ready to listen. Not yet. Before it was a scandal. Before it was a tragedy whispered in sick rooms and back alleys. It was just a woman. A mother. A wife. A widow. Her name was Mrs. Charlotte N. Winslow. That name, soft, proper, delicate, would one day be stamped in black ink on millions of labels across the United States and Britain. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It sounded safe, warm, gentle, like something your grandmother might make in her kitchen between knitting and baking bread. But Mrs. Winslow was not brewing syrup in her kitchen. In fact, she probably never brewed it at all. Charlotte Winslow was a nurse. A real one. In the early 1800s, she worked with mothers and babies in Massachusetts, helping women through childbirth, teaching them how to swaddle, how to breastfeed, how to soothe colicky infants with warm towels and soft humming. And somewhere along the way, she developed a recipe. Or so the story goes. Because there's very little evidence she actually invented the syrup that carried her name. What we do know is that her son-in-law, Jeremiah Curtis, saw potential. He was a businessman, a printer, a man who understood the power of branding in a world that was just beginning to fall in love with advertising. Curtis and his partner Benjamin Perkins took Mrs. Winslow's name, respectable, maternal, harmless, and put it on a product that had never seen the inside of her medicine bag. They mass-produced it, bottled it in decorative glass, and sent it across the country in wooden crates. Each bottle contained a secret, one carefully hidden in fine print, or not printed at all. Morphine. Sometimes alcohol, chloroform, or codeine. Whatever soothed the baby. Whatever made the mother buy it again. In 1850, few people asked questions. In 1860, sales soared. By the time the Civil War ended, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was a household name. Advertisements painted it as a miracle, a godsend for exhausted mothers. Posters showed cherubic babies sleeping peacefully, smiling in their cradles. The labels promised relief from teething, colic, diarrhea, nervousness, and all infant complaints. No prescription required. Just 1 or 2 spoonfuls. Or maybe 3. Or 4. It came in beautiful cobalt blue glass. It tasted sweet. The baby quieted down almost immediately, limp in the arms, soft breathing, eyelids fluttering closed. And then the mother could finally sleep. Do her mending. Or just sit and breathe for a moment. That was the draw. Not wickedness. Not carelessness. Just exhaustion. Motherhood in 1870 was a kind of slow drowning. And Mrs. Winslow's was a floating barrel. Of course, Curtis and Perkins knew exactly what they were doing. They printed testimonials from grateful mothers, many of them made up. They used traveling salesmen to pass out samples in towns that had never even heard of morphine. They advertised in women's magazines, in almanacs, in penny weeklies. In 1868 alone, they reportedly spent over $100,000 on advertising, more than some banks. They even offered free pamphlets on infant care, distributed through doctors' offices, without doctors' permission. One page offered advice on keeping your baby's feet warm. Another page suggested Mrs. Winslow's as the safest remedy for all childhood distress. It became a part of parenting culture, a rite of passage. The good mothers had it. The poor mothers saved up for it. Some swore by it. One letter, printed in an 1871 Chicago journal, read, "My darling had not slept for 3 nights. I feared she would waste away. A kind neighbor brought me Mrs. Winslow's. She slept 6 hours straight. I wept with gratitude." That was the story told in public. But behind closed doors, different letters were written. Not to newspapers. To coroners. To ministers. To God no one wanted to blame. And in the middle of it all stood the name. Mrs. Winslow. A name she likely never authorized. A name she may have never profited from. She died in 1851, before the syrup became a national product. Before it earned millions. Before her name was whispered by grieving mothers across the country. In death, she became immortal. Not as a nurse. Not as a mother. But as the face of a medicine she may never have touched. A medicine that calmed the babies. Until it silenced them. By 1870, something strange was happening in American homes. Doctors were whispering. Midwives were second-guessing. Some morticians were raising their eyebrows. Because the babies were sleeping too much. Not just napping. Not just teething. But gone. Whole neighborhoods had stories. The Bakersfield grocer's daughter who laid her baby down after a dose and found him still, blue-lipped, and cold 3 hours later. The Boston laundress whose infant son slept for nearly a full day after 2 spoonfuls of soothing syrup, then never woke up again. The unnamed twin girls in Ohio who both passed away within the same week, peacefully and without distress, just after a fresh bottle arrived. No one was keeping official records. The country had no FDA, no mandated ingredient disclosures, no toxicology reports on the dead. Instead, there were obituaries, short ones, with phrases like taken too soon, or a gentle passing, or God called him in his sleep. Behind these words sat exhausted mothers who had done exactly what the newspaper ads told them to do. They followed instructions. They measured doses. They just wanted relief. And instead, they were burying infants in rain-soaked cemeteries with marble angels carved over the headstones. Doctors began noticing, but many said nothing. Some were quiet out of fear, afraid of losing patients, or being labeled hysterical or unpatriotic. Others simply didn't know what was inside those soothing syrups. The bottles didn't list morphine or chloroform on the label. They didn't have to. The law allowed it. A bottle could claim to cure all childhood complaints, and no one could legally demand proof. It was a loophole so wide, an entire industry marched through it. And march they did. Between 1870 and 1900, over 20 popular baby syrups circulated through American households, each one more mysterious than the last. Dolby's Carminative, Godfrey's Cordial, Kendall's Soothing Syrup, Dr. Moffat's Teething Powder. Some contained opium. Others had brandy, laudanum, morphine, or alcohol in quantities that would flatten a grown man. And yet they were sold in cheerful glass bottles with swirling fonts and smiling cherubs. The syrups worked. The babies stopped crying. And so, the grieving continued, quietly. There was no outrage. Not yet. There were no protests. Just resignation. The idea of a grieving mother being at fault became quietly woven into public opinion. She must have given too much. She should have known better. Maybe the baby was already weak. And in a country that still buried infants by the dozen from smallpox, typhoid, or whooping cough, a dead baby wasn't necessarily unusual. It was just life. Hard, bitter, rural life. In farmhouses and tenement apartments, women whispered to each other. One might say, "I think it was the syrup." And the other would reply, "Don't say that. It helped me sleep." They couldn't afford to know. Because once you knew, once you really knew, what was inside that blue bottle, what would you do the next time your baby screamed for 6 hours straight? What would you do when your husband was working 12-hour shifts? When your other children needed supper? When your hands trembled from exhaustion and your breasts were dry and cracked? Wouldn't you do the same thing? One small spoon. Just enough for peace. That's what made these syrups so dangerous. They didn't look like poison. They looked like help. They came with promises, testimonials, and trust. No mother bought Mrs. Winslow's hoping to harm her child. They bought it because they loved their babies. They bought it because they were tired. They bought it because everyone else was buying it. And when death came, it came quietly. A peaceful face. A still crib. A baby who simply never stirred. That's why no one burned down the factories. That's why no one picketed the Curtis and Perkins offices. Because the victims never screamed. They just slipped away. Like breath. Like dreams. Like lullabies fading into silence. By the mid-1870s, something began to shift. Not in a loud, angry way, but slowly, like a draft under the door. Mothers were still buying the syrups. Babies were still dying quietly. But the silence began to thin. Some bottles started changing. Not with honesty, but with disclaimers. Take Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, by far the most infamous. Some versions of the label began to avoid exact dosages. Instead of saying contains morphine, the bottle might now read, gentle herbal formula, trusted by mothers worldwide. Which was true, but not entirely, because inside that syrup was still morphine sulfate, roughly 65 milligrams per ounce. That's more than enough to cause respiratory depression in a newborn. The manufacturers weren't confessing. They were getting cautious. Why? Because the first criticisms were beginning to appear, not from politicians or mothers, but from doctors and pharmacists. Not the ones with ad space in newspapers. Not the ones with syrup patents. But fringe voices. men with strange names and long, suspicious essays in obscure journals. In 1876, a paper was published in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal by a physician named Dr. Charles Woodbury. He referred to soothing syrups as dangerous misapplications of opium and called them a child's silent destroyer. No one listened. Not at first. But little by little, other physicians chimed in. A British medical officer named Dr. Henry Branson noted a sudden rise in infant deaths labeled as exhaustion or sudden failure, especially in households where syrup bottles were present. Another doctor wrote that some babies arrived at clinics barely breathing, eyes unfocused, hearts barely thudding. And when asked what the baby had been fed, the answer was always the same. Only a teaspoon of the syrup, doctor. Just one spoon. These reports were still rare. They were buried deep in journals, printed in tiny fonts. Few mothers ever read them. Even fewer believed them. Why would they? The syrup was on every shelf. The ads were still running. And more importantly, nothing else worked. Teething powders, sometimes made with mercury. Alcohol rubs, harsh and slow. Rocking and lullabies, beautiful, but exhausting. So even if a mother saw the article, or heard a whisper of danger from a neighbor, she often had to weigh two bad options. Use the syrup and get some sleep. Don't use the syrup, and listen to the baby scream for 6 more hours while your milk dries up and your nerves fray like twine. And many made the same choice. The whisper of danger wasn't loud enough yet. It hadn't become scandal. Not yet. But something else was starting to grow, just beneath the surface. Something that could one day bring the syrup empire to its knees. 2 things, in fact. The first was science. Better microscopes. More accurate chemical tests. Physicians were finally able to isolate and name the exact compounds inside the bottles. No more vague suspicions. Now, doctors could say plainly, this syrup contains X milligrams of morphine, which in this dosage is lethal to infants under 6 months. And the second force, one even more powerful than science. Mothers. Some were finally beginning to speak. Quietly, and often only after their children had died. They wrote letters. They submitted anonymous testimonials. Some gave interviews to local church bulletins or women's journals. One mother, from Maine, wrote, I do not wish to name the brand I used. I still do not know if it was the syrup. But I gave it to him, and he slept, and the next morning he was cold. I would like other mothers to know this might happen. That's all. These weren't crusades. They weren't lawsuits. Just voices. Little ones. Soft ones. Like the voices of babies who never woke up. And slowly, their words began to gather weight. By 1878, 2 newspapers ran quiet editorials questioning baby comforters. By 1879, a pediatricians' convention in New York featured an entire session titled The Use and Misuse of Infant Sedatives. And by 1880, even some advertisements began to change their tone. No more guaranteed safe. Now they said things like, best when used under doctor's supervision. Still vague. Still deceptive. But the armor had cracked. The bottles were beginning to whisper back. By 1880, a quiet storm was starting to build. It didn't start with mothers. It didn't even start with doctors. It started with the mail. See, as syrups and sedatives were sold by post, something odd began happening. Infant death reports, filed separately in towns and counties, started piling up in the Postmaster General's office. Patterns formed. Little towns in Ohio, rural corners of Vermont, dusty alleys in Baltimore. Different places. Same letters. Our baby passed in the night. We thought it was just teething. We gave her only 1 teaspoon. And next to these letters were packages, half-used bottles of syrup, wrapped in grief. Postal inspectors didn't know what to do. They weren't doctors. They were bureaucrats. But someone took notice. A relatively unknown Massachusetts senator named Julius Mather read one of the letters aloud during a public town meeting in 1881. He didn't name the syrup. He didn't blame the mother. But he asked a question that hung like smoke in the room. How many dead children should it take before we ask what's inside these bottles? The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They just stayed. Because by then, everyone knew someone who had lost a baby. And everyone had at least 1 bottle of syrup in the kitchen cabinet. This wasn't just a moral question anymore. It was personal. That same year, One of the earliest known consumer protection campaigns began, not with fanfare, but with a church group of mothers in Cincinnati, Ohio. They weren't scientists. They didn't know the chemical names. But they had stories. They printed pamphlets with titles like, "Your baby sleeps." But why? What's in the syrup? They handed them out in front of pharmacies and grocers. Many were torn up on the spot. Some mothers refused the pamphlets. Some wept and took two. Meanwhile, the American Medical Association began to pay closer attention. In 1882, they formed a small committee to examine infant sedative compounds. The findings were damning. One popular syrup, Dolby's carminative, was found to contain a mixture of brandy, opium tincture, powdered rhubarb, and something called cardamom oil. Another powder sold for infants contained mercury chloride. And yet, these were still being marketed as gentle comforts. It wasn't just about liquor anymore. It was a question of how many poisons were being sweetened and fed to infants. So the AMA issued a report. But what changed everything wasn't the report. It was a headline. In 1883, the New York Evening World published a front-page story titled, "The Syrup That Killed Her, A Baby's Last Sleep." The piece was graphic. It featured a grieving mother from Newark, a photo of the syrup bottle, and a full autopsy report. It shocked the nation. Not because the facts were new, but because they were finally said out loud. Newspapers across the country reprinted the story. Some ran editorials. The teething industry must answer. Who regulates the soothing syrup? Are we selling sleep or death? Suddenly, syrup companies had to respond. Some went defensive. Others quietly reformulated their products. Still others rebranded entirely, removing any reference to infants or soothing. But the damage was done. Public opinion had turned. The syrup bottles were no longer comforting. They had become suspicious. And behind closed doors, manufacturers began whispering about a new problem. Regulation. The one thing they feared more than bad press. Because for the first time, it looked like the federal government might actually care about what went into those bottles. And waiting just around the corner, crouched in the shadows of 1890, was something big. Something called the Pure Food and Drug Act. But before that law would rise, one last surge of tragedy had to come first. A national scandal. A courtroom. A child whose death would change everything. The year was 1892, and the courtroom in St. Louis, Missouri, was hot, crowded, and quiet. No one shuffled. No one whispered. Because the case on trial was unlike anything the city, or the country, had seen before. It wasn't a murder trial. Not exactly. But the accused product had caused a death. A tiny death. A 10-month-old girl named Eleanor Fay, gone within an hour of being given a spoonful of something called Windsor's infant comfort elixir. Her mother, Martha Fay, was now on the stand, pale, trembling, and clutching her apron in both fists. She'd given her daughter the syrup in good faith. The bottle claimed it was recommended by physicians, and that it would calm wind and fever without injury. But Eleanor's fever hadn't calmed. Her breathing had slowed, and by midnight, she was still, cold, gone. The prosecutor, Jacob Lawns, a sharp-faced man with a quiet voice, laid it out plainly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we do not allege that Mrs. Fay intended to harm her child. We allege that the bottle in her hand bore the mask of medicine and the heart of poison." He turned, holding up the bottle with a white cloth. The label still read, "Soothing, gentle, natural." But the ingredients list, when tested in a university lab, told a different story. 2.5% morphine tincture, 3% grain alcohol, traces of chloroform, laudanum oil base. It was a mixture that, in an adult, might bring sleep. But to a 16-pound baby with fever, it was a velvet bullet. The defense didn't deny the contents. They claimed everyone used these formulas. They claimed the dosage was too small to kill. And yet, Eleanor was dead. More importantly, this was not an isolated case. In the gallery sat 3 other families who had lost children to similar syrups. They weren't part of the official case. But they were there, silent witnesses to a public reckoning. Across the country, newspapers began to cover the trial like it was a national scandal. The St. Louis Dispatch ran headlines like, "Mother Poisoned by Trust. A Baby's Death and a Bottle's Lies." The courtroom testimony lasted 4 days. On day 3, The defense called their expert witness, an aging pharmacist named Dr. Wendell Shaw. He insisted that a touch of morphine was standard in baby syrups. "We have soothed infants for decades," he said, tapping his spectacles. "Without incident." But Lawrence had prepared. He placed a map of the United States on the courtroom wall. Pinned to the map were 43 obituaries of infants, all under the age of 1. Each had been linked, in one way or another, to over-the-counter soothing products. There was no further cross-examination. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, they declared the manufacturer, Windsor and Company, apothecaries, liable for wrongful death. They were fined the modern equivalent of $500,000 and ordered to cease production of their elixir. But the real shock came not from the verdict. It came from what happened next. Because overnight, Windsor and Company didn't just vanish. They relaunched under a new name. Gentlemorn Remedies. Same product, same formula, different label. And that's when Americans realized there were no laws stopping these companies from rebranding and repeating the same deadly cycle. The court could punish them, but it couldn't stop them. Not yet. That task would fall to an unlikely alliance. Doctors, journalists, grieving mothers, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a traveling salesman named Harvey Washington Wiley who would one day change food and drug law forever. But in 1892, they were still planting seeds. Eleanor Fay was buried in a quiet plot beneath a headstone shaped like a lamb. And next to her grave, a second bottle had been placed, not for use, but as a warning. By the dawn of the 20th century, the American public had grown tired. Tired of snake oil. Tired of magical tonics that killed their children. Tired of labels that lied. But the companies, they were just getting better at hiding. And that's when a peculiar figure emerged. Not a senator, not a priest, but a chemist with a mustache and a mission, Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley. He worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, not exactly a glamorous post in 1901. He wore stiff collars, quoted Latin, and spoke in slow, deliberate sentences that made you lean in. And yet, he would become the single greatest threat to America's thriving patent medicine empire. Wiley had one goal: expose the poisons hiding in plain sight. In food, in candy, and most urgently, in the medicine mothers gave their babies. But how? The law, as it stood, didn't care what went into a bottle, as long as it didn't explode. So Wiley built an experiment. A real one. He gathered 12 healthy young men, clean-living government clerks, and he fed them food laced with additives then found in everyday products. Boric acid, salicylic acid, copper sulfate, formaldehyde. The group became known as the Poison Squad. Their mission? To eat poison on purpose, so that mothers wouldn't feed it to their children by accident. Wiley published everything. The symptoms, the side effects, the vomit. America was horrified. And while it might not sound like it today, it was baby medicine, not ketchup or candy, that caused the deepest outrage. Because the public could stomach chemical-laced jam. But when they learned what was hidden in the syrups sold to calm infants, that was different. Wiley held up labels in front of Congress. He showed them how soothing syrup was often code for morphine, alcohol, opium. How natural digestives for teething contained chloroform. How wind soothers had enough codeine to stop a grown man's breath. The mother is not the villain, he said. The villain is the bottle that lies to her. Mothers began to write letters. Thousands of them. Some told stories of children who'd recovered. Others, children who hadn't. But one letter changed everything. It came from a mother in Toledo, Ohio, whose baby had died after being given a syrup called Lullabrew. She wrote, "I did not kill my child. The bottle did. And it smiled as it did it." That letter ran in the Washington Post. It sparked protests. Then petitions. Then hearings. Finally, after years of stalling, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. It was the first federal law to require honest labeling of medicine. No more hiding morphine behind the word comfort. No more calling chloroform herbal sleep tincture. No more lying to mothers. And yet, even that law had limits. It didn't ban ingredients. It only demanded honesty. Makers could still sell opium-laced syrups. They just had to admit it. Still, it was a turning point. Sales of certain baby medicines plummeted overnight. One newspaper declared, "The soothing syrup era is ending, not with a whisper, but with a wail." Dr. Wiley, ever the stoic, said, "We have not saved every child, but we have given mothers the truth. And that may be the beginning of justice." The passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 was like kicking over a rotten log. Suddenly, people could see what had always been crawling underneath. But even with new labeling laws, the damage was done. Trust had already begun to rot. Mothers, once the most loyal buyers of patent medicines, became their most vocal critics. They had followed the rules, bought what was marketed to them, believed what they were told, and now they saw it differently. That trust had been manufactured, and sometimes sold in ounce bottles for 30 cents a pop. So what happened next? Mothers didn't just stop buying. They organized. Across the country, women's clubs, reading circles, and church groups turned into informal consumer watchdogs. They passed pamphlets, shared lists of dangerous ingredients, warned other mothers not just about certain syrups, but about the very culture of silence. One group in Chicago even held mock funerals for the death of motherly trust. Their coffins were small, wooden cradles, stuffed with empty bottles of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Even recipe books started including alternatives. Homemade gripe water, honey stews, cooled chamomile teas. Some women, newly emboldened, wrote to newspapers demanding to know why no man in government had questioned what mothers had been given for 50 years. The headlines began to shift. What once read, "New teething formula brings relief," now became, "What's really inside baby's bottle?" And just beneath those headlines were stories written by mothers, for mothers. One 1907 editorial in Ladies' Home Journal opened with, "They told us to hush our crying babies, but no one told us what was in the hush." Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies scrambled to adjust. Some rebranded their products as herbal or botanical. Others doubled down, insisting their formulas were pure, tested, and time-proven. A few simply disappeared. And then came the wave of lawsuits. Families sued syrup makers for wrongful deaths. Some were dismissed. Others quietly settled. But perhaps the most significant shift wasn't in court. It was in the nursery. Because now, when a baby cried, a mother might hesitate. Not because she didn't love her child, but because she now knew that love could be used against her. That moment of pause. That second of doubt before reaching for a bottle. That's what changed everything. Mothers began to ask questions. Not just does it work, but who made this? Why are they selling it to me? What's in it that I can't see? And that act, questioning, doubting, demanding, wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of maternal activism. By 1910, the phrase "trust your mother's instinct" took on a very different meaning. It no longer meant soothing without thinking. It meant investigating. It meant resisting. It meant redefining what care looked like. For some, that meant herbal remedies and hand-mixed tinctures. For others, it meant refusing any bottle that didn't list every ingredient in plain words. The movement spread beyond the nursery, into kitchens, into schools, even into Congress. Because once a mother learns the truth about what she's given her baby, she doesn't just change what she buys. She changes what she'll believe ever again. As the 20th century dawned, medicine began to shift its gaze, not just on curing disease, but on understanding the fragile lives of children. Pediatric medicine slowly emerged as its own field, a quiet revolution sparked by decades of loss and lessons. Hospitals started to open wards dedicated solely to children. Doctors trained in child development and nutrition replaced the old guard who treated infants like miniature adults. But change was slow. Old habits died hard, especially among parents. Many still feared letting their babies cry, still longed for quick cures. The ghost of the syrup lingered in whispered warnings and cautious glances. Yet, new voices began to rise. Women doctors like Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female physician in the United States, championed gentle care and observation. Pediatricians urged parents to watch their children closely, not just for signs of illness, but for emotional needs too. This was a new kind of care, not just about physical survival, but about nurturing the whole child. At the same time, the rise of public health campaigns brought fresh hope. Pamphlets taught mothers about hygiene, nutrition, and safe remedies. School nurses became trusted figures, bridging the gap between home and hospital. Even the once ignored nervous child began to receive attention instead of scorn. But this progress came with challenges. Medicine was still an elite profession. Many rural families lacked access to care or trusted only home remedies. Misinformation and fear of doctors remained common. And even as society moved forward, shadows of past mistakes haunted parenting. The fear of poisoning babies with medication lingered. Some mothers distrusted doctors, others distrusted new medicines. The lesson: trust had to be rebuilt, not just in medicine, but in community. This slow healing process reshaped the way mothers, doctors, and society viewed childhood and vulnerability. It created the foundation for the modern understanding that children's needs are unique, delicate, and deserving of respect. Josiah's silent struggle, the mother's desperate search for safety, and the babies who forgot to wake up, all became part of a larger story. One about how love, fear, hope, and science collide in the intimate world of childhood. And while no one can erase the past, the legacy of those times helped shape a world where babies today sleep safer, cry louder, and grow stronger. Though over a century has passed since the days of soothing syrups and powdered chalk, echoes of those struggles still ripple through modern parenting. Today, parents face new uncertainties: vaccines, medications, screen time, dietary choices, each stirring anxieties reminiscent of the past. The fear of harming a child, despite good intentions, remains as potent as ever. Controversies swirl online, with debates over what's safe, what's necessary, and what might be harmful. Mothers and fathers often find themselves caught between expert advice and instinctual worry. And like the mothers of 1870, they sometimes carry the heavy burden of guilt when outcomes aren't perfect. Medical science has made immense progress. But trust, that fragile thread between parent and doctor, can still fray. The lessons from the chalk-eating boys and the babies quieted by syrup remind us that care is never just about facts. It's about connection, patience, and understanding the fears beneath the surface. These stories call on us to listen more carefully to parents' concerns, to validate their emotions, and to recognize that behind every decision is a desire to protect and love. They also warn us to stay vigilant against quick fixes, whether powders, pills, or screens, that promise easy answers but can mask deeper needs. In the end, parenting remains a complex journey through uncertainty and hope. And remembering history helps us see that the tender ache of wanting to do right by our children is timeless. It's a call to compassion, for parents then and now, and a reminder that in caring for the smallest among us, we must always listen closely to the quiet stories waiting to be told. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the quiet tragedy of infant deaths and mysterious illnesses sparked a slow but steady revolution. Mothers, often dismissed by doctors and society, began organizing and demanding answers. They shared stories, gathered evidence, and pushed for safer medicines and clearer warnings. One of the most powerful forces was the rise of the mothers' clubs and early advocacy groups. These gatherings became places where women exchanged advice and warnings beyond official pamphlets. They questioned the mysterious soothing syrups, refused to accept infant deaths as fate, and demanded accountability from pharmacists and manufacturers. Their voices grew louder, influencing early child welfare laws and medical reforms. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act finally brought new regulations, requiring clearer labeling and banning harmful ingredients like opium and alcohol in baby medicines. This law marked a turning point, transforming how society viewed infant care. But it was the mothers, through grief, courage, and relentless advocacy, who laid the foundation for these changes. Their quiet rebellion helped transform medicine from something distant and clinical into something responsive and humane. And though they often remained invisible in official histories, their impact lives on every time a parent safely soothes a child or questions a prescription. The story of mothers giving babies liquor in 1870 is more than a tale of tragedy. It's a story of resilience, hope, and the power of ordinary people to change the course of history. Looking back at the chalk-eating boys and the mothers giving babies liquor, we see more than strange customs or medical mistakes. We see lessons about how societies treat vulnerability, especially in children. In 1870, children's pain was often silenced or misunderstood. Boys expressed sorrow through chalk. Mothers gave liquor hoping to soothe. Both acts were born from confusion and love, but also from a lack of knowledge and trust. Today, medicine is far safer, and childhood is better understood. Yet, echoes of those old struggles remain. Modern parents still wrestle with fear and guilt. Children still find silent ways to express emotions they cannot speak. And society still debates how to balance protection with independence. The story reminds us to listen carefully, to question accepted wisdom, to value empathy as much as expertise. Because behind every strange behavior, every silent suffering, there is a human story. And in understanding those stories, we find not just history, but hope. The tragic story of the babies and the soothing syrups of 1870 did not end with silent cribs and grieving mothers. It rippled through time, shaping the very foundations of modern medicine and parental care. In the decades that followed, doctors, scientists, and lawmakers slowly began to listen. The whispered fears became urgent questions, and the quiet tragedies ignited fierce debates about safety, dosage, and truth. Labels were rewritten, ingredients carefully measured, and regulations put in place to protect the most vulnerable. Motherhood itself began to change, from isolated hope to shared knowledge, from fear and secrecy to community and support. Women gathered in salons, in church basements, and eventually through letters and newspapers, demanding better for their children and themselves. By the early 20th century, the dark shadows of forgotten to wake up were illuminated by science and compassion. Infant mortality rates dropped, and new understandings of childhood development and nutrition emerged. The mistakes of the past became lessons etched into medical textbooks and parental guides. But beyond medicine, the story of 1870 is a reminder of something deeper, how culture, fear, and misinformation can intertwine with love and desperation to shape lives in ways no one fully understands until much later. It reminds us that progress is never linear, and that every generation must reckon with its own blind spots. Josiah's silent world, the whispered lullabies, and the invisible struggles of those babies teach us that beneath every historical fact lies a human heart, fragile, hopeful, and longing to be seen and cared for. And as we look back, it is not just with sorrow for what was lost, but with gratitude for the courage that eventually led to change, a change built on listening, learning, and most of all, compassion. So next time you hold a child close, or care for someone silently struggling, remember the echoes of that long-ago winter in 1870. Remember that even in silence, there can be stories waiting to be heard, stories that shape our world in quiet, powerful ways. Because history is not just about what happened. It's about what we choose to learn, to remember, and to carry forward. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a forgotten corner of history, a story of love, loss, and the fragile hope that connects us all.